Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Everything, and I am coming back at you with another Wargaming and miniature video. In today's video, we're going to start a new series in our boot camp series. We're starting the boot camp for Battlegroup. Now, Battlegroup is a World War II miniatures game where there's going to be a number of videos, and in each video we're going to touch on a different subject or a different topic for the game Battlegroup. I've got some figures on the table here, and if you've been to any of our boot camp series videos in the past, what I'd like to do is take the rule book and read directly from the rule book and maybe interject some thought process or philosophy in what they're talking about in the rules, as well as demonstrating the rules that they are talking about specifically in the book on the table using figures and dice. Alright, there's been multiple editions of Battlegroup. This is, from my understanding, the newest edition. It came out in 2019. I think Battlegroup originally came out in 2012. So I have the 2019 version, and that's what I'm going to be using in these videos. Now, in today's video, we're going to be talking about just a simple Battlegroup introduction, how this book works, what you'll need. But in addition to that, we're going to jump a little bit into the rules, and we're going to talk about the turn and the orders that you would give during your turn. In future videos, you'll see rules on movement, you'll see rules on shooting, indirect fire, artillery, morale, the battle system, aircraft, even street fighting and night fighting, and winter rules. In addition to that, there's a number of campaign books that are available that have additional rules in those that might or might not be pertinent to the campaign that you wish to play, but I will be going over those as well. Okay, so let's talk about the introduction to Battlegroup. Well, first of all, I'm not on camera, and I'm not moving a lot of these figures around, so this is more of an audio podcast until we actually start getting into moving the troops and the rules and rolling dice. Battlegroup is a miniature wargame rules. Okay, so you have miniature figures of mortars and infantry and armor vehicles, etc. In World War II, in any theater, Pacific, East Front, West Front, North Africa, etc., using 15 millimeter or 20 millimeter figures. Personally, I don't see why you couldn't also use 28 millimeter figures. You would just have to play on a smaller scale, like a platoon, and not necessarily a company or a battalion. A lot like some other popular 28 millimeter games out there. In these rules, if you're a miniature wargamer, you're going to be familiar with measuring distances for movement and for shooting, rolling dice. These concepts are basically going to be, second nature to you. But if that's all you care about, then this game would be very bland. That's not what this game is for. This game is trying to recreate the character of a battle, either on the Eastern Front in Stalingrad, or in France 1940, or the islands of the Pacific. Okay, so each one of those battles would have, or different theaters and unit types would have a different feel to them. And this game tries to give you as a player a taste. There was a mini rule book published in a Kursk supplement, and there was a hardback edition as well back in 2012, and this one's updated. So if you have those rules, there's basically only 4 things that have changed, and that is 2-hit modifiers for aimed fire, a 2-hit modifier for aimed fire with HE, targeting units in cover, observation modifiers against units with the sniper rules, and light mortars. Okay, so let me go over those super quick to help those that already have the rules and know how to play this. And then for the rest of you that don't know how to play, go ahead and these will be touched on as the rules. They won't be considered modified rules because when we get into the rules, they're just the rules. All right, the to-hit modifier for aimed fire with small arms for units that are moving, okay, so you get a -1. The 2-hit modifier for aimed fire with small arms for units that move, -1. If you move, you get a -1 to shoot. When we get into the orders, you're going to find out that you can either shoot twice stationary, you could move twice, or you can shoot and move, or you can move and shoot. Okay, so if you are planning on moving, so you're only going to shoot once, you're going to get that -1. Because even if you shoot first, because it's considering that whole turn, you get a -1. All right. The second bullet point is no 2-hit modifier for aimed fire with HE shells when targeting units in cover. There used to be pluses and minuses for like hard cover or whatever. Now there's no modifier. Because I guess you're not shooting at the infantry, you're shooting at the cover itself, and then there's a big blast, and so etc. And we'll get into that when I actually get into shooting. Now, observation modifier against units with the, quote, sniper scout special rule, -1. Okay, there are units out there that have the ability sniper scout, or you could even just call it sniper or scout. But what it is that the individual is trained in concealment and the ability to hide and cover and stuff like this and not be observed as easy. So now you get a -1 when attempting to spot them. This becomes important during the shooting phase because you can't perform aimed fire at a unit you don't see. So snipers would be harder for you to shoot at. Now you could do area suppression, but we'll get into that. Okay, and light mortars have a range of 30 inches, where in the old editions they would have a 20-inch range. They've upped it to 30 inches. And these small rule changes are also on their website. So if you have the old set of rules, you can just go to the website, download the new rules changes, and you're good. Also, this rule book does not have Canada's Crucible in it because they wanted to make this rule book more affordable, so they took the campaign rules for Canada's Crucible out of it, but they made Canada's Crucible's Normandy campaign available as a PDF on the Plastic Soldier Company's website. This book will provide you with everything you need to play Battlegroup, recreate battles of World War II. It has the basic rule system, but if you want an army list or a campaign or a theater setting, you would need to get one of these additional books like Markegarden or Wacht am Rhein or whatever. They also have printed scenarios in those books, but there's also army list, point values, stuff like that. So this book will talk about command and control of your units. It'll talk about movement, like basic movement allowances, inches and stuff like that, difficult ground, being towed or riding in vehicles. Plus, it will talk about firing, shooting. The heart of the game is shooting, destroying your opponent, right? There's going to be direct fire. There's going to be suppressive fire. We're going to be talking about small arms. We're going to talk about high explosive, aimed fire. We're going to be talking about tanks and all that stuff. Then we'll be talking about morale. So morale, like the willingness of your units to brave the onslaught of bullets and stuff like that. Okay, it takes two forms. Individuals have morale, and your battle group has morale. Now, when we talk about battle group, that's the name of the rules, but it's also the name of your army. So when you build a, finger quotes, battle group, you're building an army to deploy on a table. When you're playing a scenario, one side of the table, let's say Germans, are a battle group, and then let's say the other side of the table is Americans. They are a battle group, because that battle group is usually split up into some infantry, some armor, some artillery, maybe even aircraft. Basically, when you design your army, you're going to want to mix it up a little bit, because you don't want to go all tanks or all infantry, because you might or might not, depending on what your opponent brings to the table, you might not have a winning chance. If you play scenarios, they're usually play balanced. Okay, so let's talk about getting started. You don't need to learn all the rules before you play. It's easier to read the rules through once with me, and then start playing. Maybe a small introductory game that doesn't have all the unit types, maybe only an infantry platoon against an infantry platoon, so you can learn how small arms fire works, and then maybe play another game where you introduce armor vehicles, and then maybe play another game where you introduce artillery. That's exactly how I learned how to play Squad Leader back in the day. They had these introductory tutorial missions, and they gradually introduced rules as you played those missions to make it so it wasn't so overwhelming. Gaming principles. There's a few principles that both players should adhere to. 1. Cooperation or cooperation. There's always a social side of wargaming, so you don't want to reach over the table and punch your opponent in the nose, and you don't want him to do that to you either, right? And you don't want to be cussing at each other or throwing your dice at each other, right? So you got to have a little bit of civility. And if you're being ruthlessly competitive, nitpicking over the rules, or line of sight decisions, or not accepting the vagaries of Lady Luck with good grace, only ruins your game. So don't be a dick, is what people are saying. You know, you got to cooperate. You got to both want to have fun, enjoy the game, etc. If you're not enjoying the game, then why do you play? All right, the next one is scale. Like I said, it was written for two scales, 20 millimeter and 15 millimeter. Models, you can find model kits in 20 millimeter, which is the 1/72nd scale, but there's also a scale out there, 1/76. They're almost indistinguishable. You know, Airfix, Italeri, Revell make a lot of models. Zvezda, Hat, Pegasus. There's a bunch of companies out there that make infantry models, plus there's armor models out there in 1/72nd. You could find a ton of varieties of tanks and armor vehicles, anti-tank guns, pretty much anything you need. And 20 millimeter is usually the metal scale of 1/72. So if you find some model company out there selling a 20 millimeter Jeep, you would be able to use a 1/72 scale Jeep, and they would be almost exactly the same size. And if you play with 20 millimeter, you could play on a table like a 4x6, and that's what most people, or what I should say, what most games are played on is a 4x6 table. But of course, larger games, more models, you might need a larger table, a 4x8, or even if you could go 6x12 or whatever. You don't want to have a bunch of models crammed into such a tight space that it doesn't allow you to maneuver. Okay, measuring distances. Using a tape measure or a ruler for measuring your ranges and whatnot. Never pre-measure. So the player has to make a decision on if he's going to shoot or not shoot or what have you before he actually measures. When you shoot your mortar, you have a 30-inch range. If they wind up being 40 inches, too bad, your mortar lands short. When measuring to a tank, don't measure to the barrel of the gun when shooting or being shot at. Always measure to the hull itself. So you measure to the hull, and because some tanks, like maybe a Jag Panther or something, might have a barrel this long, and so you don't measure from the end of the barrel. You measure to the hull. Some Shermans might have sandbags piled up. You don't measure to the sandbag. You actually measure all the way to the hull. So no extra boxes or camouflage that's added to the outside of the tank. You don't measure to that. You measure to the metal hull, the actual tank itself. For infantry units, you would just measure to the figure, the model. Now, for me, personally, I play in 15 millimeter, and I base my infantry on multi-bases. You don't have to do that, and I just measure to the base, just to make it easy. I don't necessarily worry that this guy is the farther away than the corner of this base, because I assume that those guys aren't always exactly standing in that position. They are in various positions inside that base, and maybe they're prone and not standing. Maybe they're laying side by side. Maybe Joe is on the right side of Frank, and maybe Frank is on the left side of Jimmy, or whatever. And they don't always stand exactly like that, so I just use the base. Now, if you're playing a man-to-man version where you have your models individually based, which I think I would do with my 20 millimeter figures, I would individually base them, then you'd still measure to the squad, but you measure to the middle of the squad. For units, when moving, no element with the unit should move more than the maximum movement allowance. So what they're saying is, you don't measure, okay, hypothetically, let's say I've got a squad. This is a squad, by the way, 10 guys. So let's say I've got a squad like that, right? And I plan to move, let's say I plan to move in this direction, right? I plan to move down the hedge line, right? Okay. And my movement is 5 inches, right? So I moved the front unit 5 inches, right? And we got a good movement of 5 inches. I know I'll be going over this in the movement rules later in a future video. But now I can't take all of these guys and move them up on line, because that means that last guy would be moving like 8 inches to get all the way up there. You can only move each man in your squad can only move 5 inches. So if you want to get online, you'll have to move at the slowest speed. When measuring the majority, so their models are at short range and effective range, the unit is considered to be at short range. Okay, so what they're saying there is we're still in measuring conventions, I suppose, if you want to call it that. Like, let's say I've got a squad kind of like that. Let's just hypothetically say, and I'm going to shoot at that mortar, right? And we're not actually using the real ranges, but let's say these guys are in short range, these guys are in short range, but these guys are at effective range. It would still be considered, the whole unit would be considered short range because units fire together. If this was a separate unit than this, then this would fire, and then that would fire a separate, that would require a separate order. So basically you just take the majority. Now, if this guy was in short range and both of these were ineffective, then it would be counted as the entire thing would be effective. You take the majority, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, now when you're gauging line of sight, sometimes it's unclear. There's no easier way to settle this. The players have to decide. As a guide, you should be able to get down behind the model and look as if you are the little model figure and try to see if you could see the opponent's model. A little gun barrel sticking out behind a hedge, that doesn't count. And if the two of you can't come to a decision on whether or not you should be able to see them or not, then roll a die. 1, 2, 3, you can't see them. 4, 5, or 6, you can. And remember to be generous. Okay, now units. Okay, in the game, a unit is a single thing given a single order. It might be an infantry squad, so like all 10 of those guys would be considered a single thing, so it would be given an order. Now, it might be a weapons team, like a mortar. That would be given a single order, or a single vehicle would be given an order. The army lists allow you to purchase multiple units together as platoons or squadrons or batteries, etc., but they're still considered separate units. So like an American infantry platoon might have 3 squads in it, and if it has 3 squads, each squad would be a separate thing, even though you have to buy it as a platoon. Same thing with mortars. If you buy a mortar as an add-on to a platoon, it's still considered a separate thing, right? It's not part of, well, it is part of the platoon, but it's still considered a separate entity. It's considered a unit. Now, let's say you buy not an infantry platoon, but a battery of mortars where it comes with 2 mortar tubes in the battery. They're still 2 things. Because think of the battery like a platoon with 2 squads. Each mortar battery or each mortar tube would still be considered separate. All right, so we got through basics of the rules. Now, let's talk about what you're going to need to be able to play a game. You're going to need a battle group. Okay, right. So basically you're going to need miniature soldiers, tanks, guns. You draw that from your collection. I like the way they word this here, but they say basically you're going to have a large collection of models, but you're not going to use every model in every game, because you're going to want, maybe I personally want to have some Sherman tanks. Maybe I'll also want to have some Pershing tanks. Maybe I'll want to have some M7s or some M10s or whatever, some infantry. Maybe I want paratroopers. Maybe I want line infantry, Rangers or glider troops or whatever. You're not going to include all of those in your battle group. So this is how they word it. You'll need 2 battle groups of miniature soldiers, tanks, and guns, 1 for each side. There will be drawn from the player's collection or from one player's collection, and should be the right models, and should be painted. Of course, that level of painting is up to the players, but the game is drastically enhanced by using well-painted miniatures. Listen to this. Those willing to field unpainted models need to take a hard look at themselves and seek forgiveness for their sins against gaming. Oh, that just tells you what kind of a sense of humor the McCade? What's this guy's name? Hold on. Warwick Kinraid. Yeah, that was funny. I dig it. Okay, rule book. You'll need the rule book, obviously. If you're reading this, at least you've got the rule book. As you become more experienced with the rules, you're going to use less and less of the rule book, because you'll know. You might need a reference sheet or something, but other than that, the next thing you need, number 3, theater supplement. Like personally, I do a lot of Normandy stuff, Market Garden, or even Battle of the Bulge. And so those are the theaters books that I have personally, because you get army lists, game profiles, and sometimes special rules and scenarios. You'll also need an opponent. That's not really true. You can play solitaire. Sometimes you want to play with multiple commanders on a side. You can give each one a platoon or each one a company or whatever. And then you'll need a battlefield, someplace to play the battle. A good-sized flat area to place modeled terrain, a dining room table, floor, etc. But personally, I have a table I play on. I have terrain boards and maps. But most of us will use a 4x6, but a small battle can be on a 4x4, and large battles can go even bigger. Okay, you'll need dice. You'll need D6, just standard, D6. It says you'll need about 10, and you also might need a D12. Not sure why you would need a D12, but we'll figure that out. Pen and paper. Okay, they say use pen and paper, keep track, notes, stuff like that. All right, so the first thing you need is a battle group. And the rules give collecting and painting miniatures is a large part of wargaming. I think painting and collecting miniatures is probably more than half of wargaming. I break wargaming in miniature down to about 3 parts, right? We've got designing, choosing, picking, organizing your army, looking up paint schemes, stuff like that. I consider to be that about 1/3 of wargaming. Actually, physically assembling your models, painting them, basing them, and in wargaming terrain as well, I consider that to be about 1/3 of miniature wargaming. And then the last 1/3 I consider to be actually playing and rolling the dice and moving your miniatures on a table. And then there's also knowing. Knowing is half the battle. Okay, so I don't know. Now, some people will spend their entire lives collecting models for wargaming, like myself. Unfortunately, I pick a lot of different genres, but I've been collecting World War II models for a long time. And the author says he did too. And you're never finished because there's always another model out there that you don't have that you have to get. And that's part of the hobby. So there's army lists and points and battle rating. Okay, the theater supplements will list a lot of different units: infantry squads, tanks, command units, signal units, artillery, medics, etc. And they're given a point value and a battle rating. Okay, the point value is what you use. Basically, you and your opponent are given a pool of points, and then you spend these points to buy units. And depending on how big of a game you want, like a squad-sized game, they recommend spending around 300 or 250 points, right? A platoon game, maybe 500 points. A company-sized game, maybe 1,000 points. And then a battalion-sized game, that would be a huge game. They say you spend about 1,500 points per side. They also say you're going to play that on a 6x8 table in 15 millimeter. If you play 20 millimeter, the scale of the table goes up one. So it goes 4x4, 4x6, 6x6, and then 6x8 for 15 millimeters. But 20 just starts at 6x4 and goes all the way up to 6x10, which, yeah, that's a battalion-sized game, and that's a big table. Basically, if you spend 100 points on things, and I spend 100 points on things, we should have a fairly balanced game. But that's not always the truth, because if you spent 100 points on a tank, and I spend 100 points on a squad of infantry, the battle's going to turn out a very different way than if we both spent on tanks. So points can't be the perfect solution, but it's there just to help out. Now, there's another thing called battle rating, and we're going to talk about that during the morale section of the game. But just to say this battle rating is how you win or lose the game, usually. Each side will have a rating on how mentally strong they are, how willing they are to stick it out and fight to the bitter end. And as the game goes, your battle rating will slowly go down and go down and go down until it reaches 0. And when it basically reaches 0, that tells you that your army has routed or surrendered, and so your opponent wins. Okay, now they give a note on infantry basing, and I want to go through that. It says it doesn't matter how they're based, just as long as it's obvious, like what squad they belong to. Any basing method will work. Individual basing obviously allows for removal of casualties, but multiple basing allows for movement of units easier, because you only have, you don't have 100 different miniatures to move, you only have a few. So 5 men could be mounted on a single base, and then if they receive 4 casualties, that would mean that 5-man base is actually only 1 man moving around, and it would only have a rate of fire of 1. Now, you could keep track of it on paper, or you can keep track of it with like little casualty markers. I personally use markers like this to say that there is a casualty. So there would be like a ring that I can say, okay, this guy died. Boom, he's dead. And just put a little ring on him saying that he's dead. Okay, that took a little bit longer to film than I anticipated. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go ahead and end this video at the introduction to Battlegroup, and then in the next video we're going to start breaking down the rules. Alright, so I'll see you in the next video.